Hello, everyone. This is Lydia Olander again, National Ecosystem Services Partnership. Today, we're having a webinar on some papers that we've been doing for the partnership, Ecosystem Services Conceptual Model Series. But before we get started on the presentation, just a few announcements. Just a reminder about the upcoming ACES meetings in Washington, D.C. in December. It'd be great to see everyone there. I just wanted to note a number of different things that NESP will be involved with at the ACES meeting. First, we're giving a half-day workshop on Monday on the methods for incorporating ecosystem services into decision-making. And we'll be talking about the ecosystem services conceptual models in that session. And then we'll be involved in a number of different talks and processes, one of which we'll be talking about this project, as well as a couple of other related ones on December 5th on building ecosystem service conceptual models for federal decision making. And then we'll also be talking about a project we're doing in the Gulf of Mexico using these methods at the end, on December 6th at the end of the meeting. So lots of related work will be discussed. Just briefly, overview of who will be talking on the call today. There are a lot of us. So I'll be giving the initial presentation. And as you know, I direct the Ecosystem Services Program at the Nicholas Institute and also run the National Ecosystem Services Partnership. And Sara Mason and Katie Warnell, who are policy associates that work with me here at the Institute, will be presenting as well. And then we'll also have comments from Frank Casey, who's at the U.S. Geological Survey. And he's a natural resource economist who's been working on ecosystem services for quite a while. And Pete Wiley, who's an economist with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management, who also worked with us on this project. And Rebecca Moore, another economist from the Bureau of Land Management, who's been working on ecosystem services and was involved in this project. Rebecca has sent comments in. She's not going to be able to join us in person, but I will read her comments. All right. I'm going to go ahead and start the presentation. So we're going to talk today about what ecosystem services conceptual models are and how they can help incorporate nature's benefits into implementation, into decision-making in various ways. So first of all, when we consider ecosystem services in decision-making, this can help us identify how choices will enhance, sustain, or degrade the benefits nature provides to people in a variety of different ways. One is by including additional outcomes that are not targeted, but may be important. These are the co-benefits or potentially unintended consequences. Second, by identifying who will be benefited or harmed by the changes in nature's benefits. And third, by helping us think beyond the biophysical effects to the social and economic outcomes to identify the options that yield the greatest benefits. So given that, how can we integrate ecosystem services into decision making? So one tool that many think might be helpful is conceptual models. Conceptual models are often called other things. They've been called logic models, results chains, or theories of change models, and there are lots of other names as well. They're used by many different disciplines and organizations, including conservation organizations like the Nature Conservancy and their conservation by design approach. They've been called for by reports from the National Academies of Sciences and included in guidance on designing indicators, and also used by other organizations like USAID. So they're commonly in use for this kind of thing. So what do we mean by an ecosystem services conceptual model? So these conceptual models link changes caused by an external stressor or an intervention, so policy or management or project, and how that changes the ecological system. So these are the changes in the infrastructure or in the ecosystem structure and function, and these can be measured by ecological indicators. And then we look at how that changes the human well-being and the socioeconomic system, outcomes for people, changes in benefits and ecosystem services. And then from there, we can look at how that changes social welfare and how values are realized or perceived and by affected people. And we also can see that there's direct effects of an intervention on human well-being. That's the model, the line that runs around the bottom there. And these types of models can be used to underpin both simple and complex methods. while helping to improve consistency and credibility in how ecosystem services are incorporated into decision-making. So just quickly, this is an example of an ecosystem services conceptual model that was developed to compare green versus gray shoreline options. It's very simplistic, and I know it's got a lot of details you can't read, but the key things I want you to see are that the left-hand side is a model that is a green infrastructure option, and the right-hand side is a gray infrastructure option. And what these models are able to show is that in the blue boxes, we have things that tend to be good outcomes or positive outcomes, and in the red, we have some negative outcomes. And while the gray infrastructure is very strong in some of these blue positives on erosion and storm damage, it tends to have some other negative consequences for habitat and erosion of adjacent areas, while the green tends to have a broader suite of benefits. So it just allows you to start thinking in a systems way all the way to ecosystem services outcomes. So in this work, we've been thinking about 3 different types of conceptual models and part of the process for developing them. So we have exploratory models, and these tend to be preliminary models. They are incomplete and unspecified. They're an initial sketch that tend to be quickly developed, working with stakeholders and experts. And then there's general models, which are completed models that have been checked with experts, and these capture changes in generalized categories that represent a habitat or intervention type, or some might call these a parent model. And these can take a few weeks to get sufficient expert input to develop. And then we have specified models, and you can build those off of either exploratory or general models. And these are when vetted and models that bring together the stakeholder and expert input to get at the specifics that are relevant to a place or context. So these are the ones that are most likely to be used in a decision and to have quantifiable indicators. And these require input from both experts and stakeholders to be able to pull them together. Generalized models are really the primary implementation tool that we talk about and think about when we're trying to incorporate ecosystem services broadly into agency decision-making. These generalized conceptual models can be adapted to and specified for different contexts, and they can be used to streamline application and enhance consistency of ecosystem services considerations. They could potentially be incorporated into agency directives or manuals or handbooks in various ways to help managers. So we think agencies, with help from others, could develop kind of a set of reference models that would apply to their decision-making context and create associated evidence libraries, which is a collection of studies or models that would help back those up and be useful for implementation. These general models can then also provide a common set of endpoints or ecosystem services to be considered and be the basis for developing a common set of metrics or indicators to use, as well as a set of the credible best available science in an evidence library that would go with the model. And these could also provide the basis for quantification models that could be developed consistently to provide consistent quantification across applications. So we think these general models would be useful for streamlining National Environmental Policy Act related assessments, for building common assessment templates for activities ranging from forest planning to coastal restoration to energy development siting to incentivizing native plantings in agricultural fields. So a wide variety of activities could probably benefit from these kinds of generalized models. So one of the primary papers we wrote, kind of the background paper, talks about how do you build these evidence-based ecosystem service conceptual models and the various pieces of them. And so the paper goes through these 6 different topics, starting with an exploratory or general model, how to specify that model for a context, how to clarify the model assumptions, how to build an evidence library and assess that evidence, and then map the strength of that evidence. And then also touches on a couple other additional things, which are developing common indicators and building a predictive model from the base of that conceptual model. And both of these add-ons, the indicators and predictive models, are things we are working on now with agencies and new projects. So we'll be learning more about that over the next year or two. So now I'm going to do a very quick walkthrough of these different steps in developing the model so you have a better sense of what these are. So first, in building an exploratory or general model, there are 4 questions we think that can help start the model building process. First, how does an intervention affect biophysical and ecological conditions, things like infrastructure or ecosystem structure and function? And then second, how do the changes in biophysical and ecological conditions lead to changes in the delivery of goods and services, including ecosystem services, to the specific people who are using them, affected by them, or who are appreciating them? So this could be something like the availability of irrigation water for farmers, or the sustainability of a rare bird population. And then third, how do those changes in the delivery of goods and services affect benefits or cost to individuals or groups? Things like time spent in traffic, cost of hospital visits, additional fish caught, value of property. And then finally, how does an intervention directly affect people? So this could be through things like restoration, job creation, access to resources, or capacity building. So those are the kinds of questions we use to develop the model and figure out what goes in it. And then next, we need to specify these models. So here's an example for a project we did on salt marsh restoration in San Francisco Bay. And I've just pulled out a few of the ecosystem services outcomes that we were talking about. So for health impacts related to water quality, we wanted, these could be from exposure to contaminated water from swimming or drinking. We wanted to understand first if they were important or relevant in the San Francisco Bay Area. If so, which contaminants introduced the greatest health risk, and also to understand which populations were at risk and were vulnerable to these health risks. So that's an example, and we wanted to do that for all the different kinds of outcomes to make sure we fully understood the specific issues that were at hand for the case. And so that's how we specify these models and make them relevant to specific contexts. Next, we want to articulate the assumptions in these models. So between every set of boxes in the model, there's a set of arrows that are assuming a relationship, and we want to make sure that we're explicit in what's in that relationship and that we understand it. And so we are trying to articulate that clearly in this approach. And so here's an example where we're looking at algal blooms, dissolved oxygen, and marine wildlife populations, and just picking one of those. The relationship between dissolved oxygen and the marine wildlife. Marine wildlife requires dissolved oxygen to survive, and low dissolved oxygen can cause physiological stress or death. And it can also alter ecological communities. And a common threshold that we found for dissolved oxygen is 2.0 milligrams of oxygen per liter. And then, but this threshold can differ depending on the taxa. So that's the existing kind of assumptions and information we know about that relationship. And taking this to the next level, we'd like to actually develop an evidence library, kind of the state of knowledge about the relationships within the model. And so we, in this case, in the cases that we're going to present today, we developed evidence libraries, and these describe the relationship between each, for each arrow, between each set of boxes. We summarize the evidence for that relationship. We talk about the confidence and the assumption given the available evidence. And we list other factors that may result in variation in these outcomes: location, timing, other external drivers. And then we list our sources for that. So we provide this for the whole model, so we have a sense of what's known and how well we know it. So the evidence can describe general or site-specific relationships between the nodes and include individual research studies, models, or calculators. If we have it, meta-analysis, sometimes case studies, and sometimes we might need to include expert opinion or local knowledge, especially for the more specific outcomes. Where no good evidence was available, we sometimes were able to identify a study that was done in a different location or different context that we flagged as an example of the type of study that would be needed to actually fill an evidence gap in our model. So we hope that provides a useful resource for people. And then we assessed the strength of evidence, and we used this evidence assessment matrix that was developed by the Bridge Collaborative. And the idea with this matrix was to build a matrix that would work across different types of evidence, whether it was expert opinion or a meta-analysis. And the criteria that we included are criteria that are common across different kinds of assessment matrices for evidence. So we include types of evidence. Is there more than one type? Consistency of results. Do multiple sources and types of evidence suggest similar results. Accepted methods, are the methods well documented and accepted by research communities? And applicability, are the results likely to be relevant to the context or site of interest? So those are the criteria that were used. And the other thing to think about when assessing evidence is there are actually kind of two aspects of evidence that we considered. The first is the existence of a relationship between two nodes. Does a change in one node actually lead to a change in the other? And the second consideration, which is dependent on the first, is the predictability of the change. Do we have the evidence to show how one node will change given the changes in the other node? And our evidence library actually looks at both of those, and we want to highlight the predictability of the relationship wherever we can. And some of our newer work focuses on actually developing evidence libraries focused on predictive models as the basis for kind of understanding our capacity to develop predictive models based on some of these conceptual models. So external factors are a key thing that are incorporated into these evidence libraries, and they're really important to consider. So in this example, we have a relationship between salt marsh habitat area and flooding, but that relationship is significantly affected by sea level rise. So we need to make sure that's incorporated so that we can understand its effect on the relationship. And here's an example of the strength of evidence map that's based on that evidence assessment. This example is for a large-scale solar installation in western United States. And in this, the green color means we have a high level of a high strength of evidence. The yellow is a fair or moderate strength of evidence, and the purple means low or no evidence. And so here we can get a sense of what's well known and where the critical research gaps are that may tie to critical outcomes. So it may be a useful resource for identifying critical research areas for different considerations. And then this is an example just to kind of describe what we mean by indicators. So once we've identified a common set of critical ecosystem services outcomes or social benefits, we can potentially think about selecting a common set of indicators or metrics for monitoring or tracking performance of interventions. And these can be monetary or non-monetary measures depending what's relevant for a decision context. And then just briefly, I wanted to give a sense of how hard it is to do this and how much time it takes. It's really quite quick to develop an exploratory model. It can take anything from an hour to a day, and you just need some familiarity with ecosystem services and conceptual models to do that. A more refined model, general or specific, can take 1 to 2 weeks to kind of get a review in to understand this kind of state of knowledge, to interview some experts and maybe some stakeholders, and refine the model. So that can be 1 to 2 weeks. Identifying socioeconomic indicators or metrics can be part of that process of developing the models, so that can also take place relatively quickly. But then assessing the indicators or metrics for feasibility may take a bit more time, depending on how much information is available. And then finally, developing an evidence library and an evidence assessment, we think can take about 6 weeks full time for one person to develop a new one from scratch, and 3 weeks or less if you're adapting an older one and just adjusting it in various ways. And we find that a lot of these models tend to be similar to one another. If you're working in a coastal system, for example, the salt marsh model will have overlap with an oyster reef model that'll have some overlap with a mangrove model. So there's efficiencies once you start building them. So I'm just going to quickly run through what we think are the various benefits of using ecosystem service conceptual models and how they can help with implementation. So first, they can help get stakeholders and experts on the same page, make sure we're talking about the same thing. Second, they can provide an intuitive entry point for those who are new to considering ecosystem services. You don't really need to be familiar with that term to actually understand these models and use them. They can capture priorities for a community or a project and link them to the interventions in a transparent and systematic way. They can make sure that no critical outcomes or impacts are missing from consideration. They can provide an evidence-based qualitative assessment of ecosystem services implications of interventions. So like that example we showed of the green versus gray shoreline. They can provide a common foundation of best available science to reduce time and expertise needed for use and to reduce duplication of effort. So if we have that evidence library available, not everybody has to build it from scratch. We can identify critical information gaps that generate significant uncertainty for decision makers and pinpoint crucial research and monitoring needs from our evidence assessments and our strength of evidence gap map. We can identify a subset of socioeconomic metrics that best capture important ecosystem services outcomes. So we can tie indicators to those outcomes that have been identified through this modeling process. And this all, if we do this, if we build this all off of some common general models, we can provide consistency in which services are assessed, what evidence is considered, and what metrics are selected, which could be a very valuable thing for agencies and others trying to implement this. And finally, these models can provide a consistent and credible foundation for building more detailed assessments, whether they're qualitative or quantitative, monetary or non-monetary. These can provide the foundation for that. Using these types of models to support implementation, I keep mentioning this idea of kind of developing a reference set of models or a library, and we have another paper where we talked about this idea, and we used a U.S. Forest Service forest management actions as the example. And so we have here just a quick table that talks about the types of goals and actions that are common across forest management planning. And what we think is that, like in this example, if you have kind of a constrained set of ways in which managers manipulate the natural environment and a fixed number of effects that such management can have on the environment, it seems possible to establish a reference set of evidence-based conceptual models that could become a go-to resource for implementation that provide that efficiency and consistency in application. And we think the development of such a repository would transition ecosystem services consideration from an interesting concept to an actionable approach that could be kind of streamlined for agency action for natural resource management. Okay, so I'm now going to pass this over to Katie Warnell, who's going to just talk about one of our examples. So sorry, just moving things here.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about one application of this method that we've recently completed, which is exploring the impacts of large-scale solar installation on Bureau of Land Management land. And this project was done in collaboration with BLM. So to give a little bit of background, the Bureau of Land Management manages a large amount of land in the southwestern U.S. that has a high potential for solar energy development. And there's been a lot of interest in building large-scale solar energy facilities on that land in recent years. Since 2009, there have been 37 large-scale solar projects approved on BLM land. And of course, while this clean energy from solar power helps to reduce carbon emissions from the homes and businesses that use it, these projects do have land use and infrastructure requirements that can affect a range of ecological, cultural, and social resources. So to facilitate solar energy development in suitable areas while minimizing any adverse impacts, BLM has developed the Solar Energy Program. A major part of this program is a designation of solar energy zones in 6 southwestern states, which are shown on this map. So these SEZs are areas with high potential for solar energy where ecological and social impacts are expected to be relatively low. And projects that are planned within these areas go through a streamlined authorization process, but they are still required to have a site-specific environmental assessment. So ecosystem service conceptual models can provide a consistent framework for assessing the environmental and social impacts of individual projects by capturing the full range of potential ecological effects and connecting those effects to people. So we worked with BLM to develop a general ecosystem service conceptual model for large-scale solar energy development on their lands. So this is the model that we developed, which is through an iterative process working with BLM staff and with expert reviewers from a variety of disciplines. So it starts with solar development, which is in the yellow box on the left-hand side, and it shows the cascade of ecological changes that can result in ecosystem service or social outcomes and economic effects. The model includes a variety of ecosystem service outcomes ranging from jobs and electricity produced by the solar energy facility to effects on wildlife, cultural resources, recreational activities, and property values. Since this is a general model, not every planned solar energy project in the solar energy zone will have all of the effects shown in the model, but it provides a starting point to consider which effects are relevant for a particular project, and that can help to streamline and standardize the environmental assessment process. And one thing I'd like to point out in this model are the dashed arrows that indicate short-term impacts, while the solid arrows indicate long-term impacts. We found that some of the effects from large-scale solar installations are caused by the construction process, and they don't persist once construction is complete. So things like dust, traffic, and sound effects fall into that short-term category, while permanent changes like infrastructure and land clearing have longer-term effects. And this distinction can help to identify which outcomes will be more significant and when they're likely to occur. And then finally, the numbers that you see in each of those arrows can correspond to the sections in the evidence library that's included in the report for this project. And as Lydia described earlier, the library both describes the evidence available to support each of these connections, and it gives a rating of the quality of evidence based on that evidence assessment matrix. So that's all I'll say about this project for now, but feel free to ask about it at the end or check out the report for all the details.
Now Sara Mason's going to talk about our next example.
All right, so we also approached NOAA to do a test case ecosystem service conceptual model, and the NERS, which is the National Estuarine Research Reserve System, seemed an appropriate venue for applying our methods. For those of you unfamiliar with the NERS, it represents a network of 29 coastal sites around the United States, and these research reserve sites are responsible for stewardship, research, training, and education in the estuarine systems where they're located. And each site is a partnership between NOAA and the U.S. state where it is situated. The recently updated NERS strategic plan actually calls out ecosystem services as an area of focus. So we thought this would be a great opportunity to work with the NERS to think about how using ecosystem service conceptual models might standardize the way they approach ecosystem service projects as well as management activities. So we thought that if all NERS sites had a set of generalized models that represented the common coastal habitats that they manage, each NER could take those models and specify them to describe their local context. This way, all NERs could have a common way of thinking about how ecosystem services flow from the habitats they manage. No NER would have to start from scratch when thinking about how ecosystem services flows might be occurring and what evidence exists behind all of those ecosystem services flows. And we could also potentially develop a common set of indicators or metrics to standardize measurement of those common ecosystem service model endpoints. So while this was our grand vision, we had to start out smaller than that to test our ideas and work with NERS representatives to see how this might actually play out. And to do this, we started by developing one generalized model for salt marsh restoration. This is the salt marsh restoration model, and you can see it follows that same structure that Katie just described by starting with the management intervention of salt marsh restoration on the left in the yellow hexagon, and flowing through ecological and biophysical changes in the blue boxes to ecosystem services in the green ovals with possible economic effects in the teal boxes all the way on the right. And you'll notice, similar to the BLM model, this stays quite general. We had to keep this model at a high level so that it might be applicable or adaptable to any NER site. So for example, this means that salt marsh restoration is left without any detail. That box could represent a variety of different things, from removing a levee to restoring natural vegetation, or to increasing marsh height, or potentially a combination of various restoration activities. And I'll note that this paper also includes a full evidence library, so all of those arrows have entries that describe the available evidence behind the link, as well as suggested ways to predict how to quantify each link where there is a quantification method that exists. We also developed a companion paper to this NOAA NERS test case to test how that general salt marsh model might actually be applied at various NERS sites. And we did 3 brief case studies. The first was a retrospective case for Great Bay, New Hampshire. The next was a prospective case for San Francisco. And the third was a quantitative case for that same San Francisco site. The first is the retrospective Great Bay case. And this was a unique opportunity because the Great Bay NERD actually did an ecosystem service assessment a few years ago. And we were able to essentially map that assessment to our general model, which you can see here. The parts in bolded color represent the pathways and services that were included in the assessment, and dashed lines represent linkages that were not included in our original model, but needed to be added for the Great Bay context. We also included the specific metrics that were used in the Great Bay Ecosystem Service Assessment with benefit relevant indicators, or essentially ecosystem services metrics shown in purple, and economic measures shown in the white tags on the right. Our next case was the San Francisco NER. This case represents a marsh site that is planned for restoration but has not yet been restored. So what we did in this case was gather a group of local stakeholders who are familiar with the marsh restoration plan and ask them to help us adapt and specify the model to expected changes for the San Francisco marsh restoration site. And this is the model that resulted from that stakeholder engagement. You can see that for this site, the original salt marsh model was mostly maintained. However, there are some grayed out portions where stakeholders ranked services that were not relevant in their particular case. And finally, we worked with a team here at Duke to turn that same San Francisco model that you just saw into a quantitative Bayesian network model to test how an ecosystem service conceptual model could be used as a framework for predictive modeling. This model is actually still in progress, but this is an image of the quantitative model framework, which is, again, based on that San Francisco model created by the stakeholder group. You can see there are multiple restoration outcomes involved in this marsh restoration project, and those are shown in the yellow boxes on the left. And each restoration action in this quantitative model can kind of be turned on and off to see how individual pieces of the restoration might actually affect ecosystem services outcomes, which are shown on the right. And the model can be broken down into submodels, which you can see an example of in these pull-out boxes as well. I ran through these cases very quickly, but I'd be happy to answer more questions about them, and you can also read about them in more detail in this paper in the series. Okay, so I just wanted to briefly say that this work is leading to a bunch of other examples that we're now working on. So we are working in the Gulf of Mexico with the Restore Council and some of with the states and folks from NERDA on adding common indicators for oyster reef restoration. And next year we'll be doing a different coastal restoration action. And then with the NOAA NERD sites, we're continuing our work with them and trying to build out oyster reef and mangrove examples where we'd also look at some common indicators. And then we have a project with the Department of Defense, with CERTIP, and with the U.S. Forest Service, where we're starting to try to use conceptual models as the foundation for doing, for developing a framework for predictive modeling. And with the Forest Service, we'll be doing one of those evidence libraries, but for the predictive model side, to understand what models we have to do this and where we're missing models that might be needed for doing a full predictive model. Okay. So we ran through a lot there, but I do want to take a minute here to let some of our agency partners talk about their perspective on this work. So I wanted to invite Frank Casey, who is actually behind this project and helped make it happen. We're going to unmute you, Frank, so you can make a few comments.
Okay, thank you very much, Lydia. And thank you for the presentations, Lydia and Katie and Sarah. Excellent work. The motivation behind USGS supporting this particular effort was to build upon the FRAMES project that Duke University carried out in terms of a Federal Resource Management and Ecosystem Services guidebook. and there was the start of using these conceptual models, and we wanted to, we being not only USGS, but other federal agencies, other bureaus within USGS, like our Ecosystems Bureau, wanted to build upon that and go into other areas. NOAA, for example, in the BLM case study, to sort of expand the use and application of these models to different resources and different questions. I think what we're finding is that the models are extremely useful from the standpoint of being, for agency personnel, being able to save time compared to a very involved NEPA analysis or a project planning analysis. So there's a cost savings aspect to it, but there's also, and I think everybody alluded to this, especially Lydia, was the very crucial importance of stakeholder involvement to make sure that there's no unintended consequences of a particular management action, and that everybody's included in being able to develop these causal chains, as some people refer to them. So I think I might leave it there. The other context to this is that we felt that the conceptual models were going to be very useful with the informal or formal implementation of by federal agencies of using an ecosystem services framework for project planning and management, which was originally put forward in October of 2015. So we're still, that work is still being done on the part of the administration, but in the meantime, agencies such as the Forest Service, NOAA, BLM, certain parts of the other parts of USDA besides Forest Service, EPA are employing these conceptual models to on-the-ground problems, and that to us is the whole reason for having supported this and trying to push the envelope a little bit further. So I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Frank. Very helpful. Going to move on to Pete Wiley. We'll unmute you, Pete.
Okay, thanks, Lydia and Sara. It was great to work with your team on this, and I'm so excited to see both of these reserve-related reports come out. One of the big things that I think this conceptual modeling process gets us is a consistent approach for habitats that are common among the reserves. Having some reference conceptual models, I think, provides for a convenient and consistent starting point for conducting ecosystem services work in the reserves. And I think, one of the challenges that we had with doing ecosystem services work in the reserves is people come at it from one discipline or another. And so it's a great way to intentionally collaborate between our biophysical research staff and social scientists and outreach staff. I think the conceptual models are a great way to kind of see in a glance, and then go into great detail when need be, the whole picture of how a management action or some other action feeds throughout the system, both from a biophysical perspective and through to human benefits. So I think there's great potential in using these models in the future, and I'm very happy to see that NEARS is on the list for future work, and I look forward to continuing to use them and enhance our ecosystem services work in the reserves with these models. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. All right. Rebecca Moore is in transit right now from a workshop, so she sent some comments to me that I'm going to read. She's with the Bureau of Land Management, and she said, I see great potential in using this type of conceptual model in our decision making. If we develop models for a variety of typical management decisions, such as oil and gas development, grazing actions, and recreation decisions, we could set them in a generic context not tied to a specific location or project, make sure they are well documented, and encourage our analysts and decision makers to start with these models and adjust them to specific decision contexts. This would increase the consistency in how similar projects are considered and could help streamline the NEPA, both by speeding up the process and providing summary graphics to convey a lot of well-referenced information.